Welcome to Forgotten Worlds for Sleep, where history breathes in whispers, and every night becomes a doorway into the past. Tonight, we drift into one of humanity's most luminous legacies, the 1001 Nights, a collection born not from peace, but from fear, from a woman's courage to speak when silence meant death. Her name was Shahrazad, armed with nothing but her voice. She faced a king consumed by vengeance, and for 1001 nights, she told stories so powerful, they transformed cruelty into compassion, and despair into wonder. These are not merely fables of merchants and jinn, but parables of survival, forgiveness, and the timeless magic of storytelling itself. So as the night deepens, close your eyes, and let the sands of old Baghdad carry you away, to a realm where every dawn was bought, with the power of a single story. Long before Arabia's deserts knew the name of Shahrazad, long before Baghdad's domes shimmered above the Tigris, stories lived by firelight in the marble halls of ancient Persia. It was the 6th century. Outside the palace walls, snow drifted over the Zagros Mountains, but inside, flames from bronze braziers painted the walls with liquid gold. The empire of the Sassanids, the last great flowering of pre-Islamic civilization, glowed with confidence. Silk banners hung from cedar beams, soldiers stood in mirrored armor, and nobles reclined on carpets so finely woven that a man's shadow seemed to melt into them. Here, in the courts of kings like Khosrow, storytelling was not an idle pleasure. It was a science of influence, a discipline of power. Royal chroniclers did not simply record events, they transformed them. Every campaign became an epic, every decree a legend. What the historian could not defend with facts, the storyteller could redeem with rhythm. Around the emperor's throne, poets, astrologers, and philosophers waited their turn to speak. But when the storyteller rose, even generals fell silent. They called their great collection Hazar Afsan, the 1,000 Stories. Its origins are lost in the blur between myth and memory. The storytellers claimed the number was symbolic, a sign that the tales could never truly end. Each story led to another, like pearls on an endless string. Tonight, they might speak of a hunter who found the gate to the underworld. Tomorrow, of a queen who outwitted demons with her cleverness. The tales were mirrors for the empire itself, complex, shining, and endless. In these halls, narrative was politics. A wise monarch knew that victory on the battlefield could fade, but a well-told story could secure immortality. The Sassanid kings understood that history remembered not the conqueror with the largest army, but the one with the most compelling tale. So they invested in memory itself. They gathered the brightest poets from the cities of Ctesiphon, Gunshaper, and Nishaper. They preserved chronicles in Persian script, translated Greek and Sanskrit into their own tongue, and filled archives with scrolls that blended fact and legend until neither could be told apart. The storytellers worked in teams. Some were professional narrators, their voices trained to rise and fall like music. Others were scholars, searching dusty manuscripts for ancient motifs. And there were those rare few who could do both, speak with fire and write with precision. These masters became the empire's invisible architects, shaping how generations would remember their rulers. They knew the secret. A story that ends dies. A story that continues becomes power. That is why the Sassanid narrators perfected the infinite tale. Each night, they left their audience suspended between revelation and wonder, promising that tomorrow's story would resolve today's mystery. The audience returned, night after night, hungry for completion. In that anticipation lay control. The art was called Nakali, the weaving of suspense. From it would grow the structure that would one day cradle Shahrazad's 1001 Nights. But even as the storytellers performed for kings, they carried within their voices the echoes of older worlds. From the east, Indian merchants brought their animal parables, where jackals debated the ethics of rule and turtles lectured princes on wisdom. From the west came the shadow of Mesopotamian myth, the first hero, Gilgamesh, who sought immortality and found only grief. Egyptian travelers carried rumors of pharaohs commanding jinn, of priests who spoke to the dead through painted walls. Each culture left its fingerprint upon the Persian imagination, blending into something new. In those firelit halls, tales were more than entertainment. They were a map of civilization's soul. They explained why kings ruled, why the stars moved, why love could both heal and destroy. When the storytellers spoke of cosmic battles between good and evil, they were not only repeating Zoroastrian theology, they were instructing their listeners on how to live. Every fable was a coded philosophy, every myth a mirror for the moral order. And yet, behind the grandeur, something else stirred. Empires, like stories, depend on their tellers, and no tale lasts forever. As the 7th century dawned, new winds began to rise from the Arabian deserts, winds carrying a different kind of revelation. The fire temples still burned, but faintly, as caravans began to whisper of a prophet in the west, whose words came not from memory, but from divine command. The storytellers listened, uneasy, sensing that a new narrative was being written, one that might absorb their own. Still, for now, the empire held, and in the great winter halls, where snow melted on marble steps and perfumed smoke curled toward the vaulted ceiling, the storytellers continued their craft. They performed for kings who no longer believed in immortality, but who still craved its sound. Their words shimmered across centuries, carrying with them the first heartbeat of a tradition that would outlive the empire itself. For in those Persian nights, by the flicker of oil lamps and the hum of lyres, humanity learned one of its oldest truths, that the story outlasts the storyteller, and that power spoken aloud can never truly die. Long before the storytellers of Persia discovered their perfect rhythm, caravans from the east were already carrying something far more valuable than silk or spice. They carried wisdom, folded into fables, disguised as animal tales, and preserved in the rhythmic cadence of Sanskrit verse. Along the ancient routes that crossed the Hindu Kush and the deserts of Baluchistan, merchants traded not only goods, but ideas, stories that taught how to rule, how to survive, how to think. In the courts of the Sassanid kings, these tales found fertile soil. The Indian scholars called their great collection Panchatantra, the 5 treatises. At first glance, it was a book for princes, a manual of political strategy, but its true brilliance lay in disguise. Every lesson of power was wrapped in a parable. A lion and a bull might stand for a ruler and his minister. A jackal might become the symbol of cunning counsel. These animals spoke in human voices, argued like philosophers, and schemed like courtiers. The Persians recognized genius when they heard it. They translated the collection into Middle Persian and gave it a new name, Kalila wa Dimna, after the 2 jackals who narrated its moral puzzles. Within a century, the book became the most influential work of political philosophy in the Eastern world, so persuasive that rulers treated it not as fiction, but as a guide to survival. In those tales, power was never simple. Kings failed not through weakness, but through ignorance of human nature. Ministers triumphed not through virtue, but through understanding. And above all, wisdom spoke softly, often through the mouths of those least expected, the weak, the humble, the overlooked. The storytellers of Persia absorbed these lessons into their own craft. They began to understand that a fable could teach what a sermon could not. A poet might speak to the heart of a tyrant more effectively than a priest ever could. An animal could say things that a human could never dare. As Kalila wa Dimna spread westward, it changed shape again. In Baghdad's golden age, Arabic translators polished its prose until it gleamed like cut glass. Its stories entered the libraries of Damascus and Cordoba, carried by scholars and sailors alike. Christian monks copied it into Latin. Jewish scholars rendered it into Hebrew. Each language left its scent upon the stories, and each version became a reflection of the culture that adopted it. By the time it reached medieval Europe, Kalila wa Dimna had become the fables of Bit Pai, and the jackals Kalila and Dimna were no longer just tricksters. They were ambassadors of an ancient Eastern logic. That wisdom often hides behind masks, but the heart of the philosophy never changed. The fables taught that the world was fragile, that fortune was fickle, and that power could destroy its holder as easily as it could raise him. Do not strike with both hands. One story warned a king. Use one to punish and one to heal. In the calm of Persian night, these lessons became something deeper. The storytellers saw how narrative could shape conscience itself. They began to weave Indian motifs into their own traditions. Talking birds became teachers of humility. Enchanted elephants carried the burden of justice. Serpents guarded the border between wisdom and desire. Through this blending, a new kind of story began to form, neither wholly Persian nor Indian, but something greater, a moral universe where animals and humans shared the same flaws and hopes. And still, the storytellers learned one more crucial art from their Indian predecessors, the art of the story within a story. The Panchatantra was a maze of narration. One fable opened another. One speaker passed the tale to the next, until the listener no longer knew where the beginning had been. This structure was more than a clever trick. It reflected the philosophy of life itself, that every act is part of another story. Every choice echoes across unseen worlds. When these ideas reached Persia, they merged perfectly with the Sassanid hunger for continuity. The story within story became a sacred architecture, a way to hide dangerous truths inside harmless entertainment. If a tale offended the king, the teller could always say, "It was not I who spoke, but the jackal, or the merchant, or the ghost." And so the storyteller survived. In candlelit chambers, surrounded by scholars and courtiers, they practiced this new art of infinite narrative. Each evening became a labyrinth of lessons, each night a mirror of the next. The Indian wisdom that had crossed mountains and deserts now pulsed at the heart of Persian imagination. It had found its truest home. From these meetings of cultures, the Indian and the Persian, the sacred and the secular, was born something neither empire could have imagined, a living organism of tales that would travel farther than either of them. It would one day absorb the voices of Arabs, Greeks, Egyptians, and Jews. It would teach emperors and peasants alike. And centuries later, when a woman named Shahrazad would step before a murderous king to tell her first story, she would be carrying that same flame, the wisdom of animals, the patience of philosophers, and the knowledge that stories, like rivers, always find their way to the sea. For now, the caravans still moved across the desert, bells jingling softly in the starlight. And somewhere between India and Persia, between fact and fable, the thousand stories were gathering their breath. Before paper, before ink, before alphabets had learned to breathe, there were clay tablets pressed with wedges, and walls carved with stories of kings and gods. The Persian storytellers, sitting by their firelit braziers, inherited not only the wealth of empires, but the memories of worlds much older than their own, Mesopotamia and Egypt, two ancient civilizations that had already turned myth into art thousands of years before Arabia was born. In the ruins of Babylon and Uruk, scribes had once etched the tale of Gilgamesh, the restless king who could not accept the limits of mortality. His journey through cedar forests, across the waters of death, to the far edge of the world, had survived millennia. When Persian chroniclers later spoke of heroes seeking immortality, or of rulers tormented by loss, they were unknowingly repeating verses first sung in the shadow of Mesopotamian ziggurats. Gilgamesh's story carried within it the earliest pattern of what would later become the hero's journey, a soul driven from comfort into peril, from pride into humility, and finally toward understanding. It was a tale not of conquest, but of awakening, and for the storytellers of later ages, it offered something more profound, the idea that narrative could be a mirror for the human condition itself. From Mesopotamia also came the notion that stories and gods were inseparable. Every myth explained not only the heavens above, but the order of the earth below. The Persians absorbed this belief with reverence. Their own religion, Zoroastrianism, spoke of a universe in eternal struggle, light against darkness, truth against deceit, and in every tale of kings and monsters, one could hear the echo of those older conflicts, retold through human voices. Farther west, the Nile carried its own kind of wisdom. Egypt was a land of rhythm. The cycle of flood and drought, death and rebirth, and its stories reflected that sacred pulse. Here, magic was not an illusion but a law of nature. Pharaohs ruled by divine right because they knew the hidden words that bound the world together. In papyrus scrolls, the Egyptian scribes recorded tales where speech itself shaped destiny. There were magicians who could reassemble a severed head with a verse, or make wax crocodiles come to life. There were talking animals, enchanted objects, and spirits who moved between the worlds of the living and the dead. When these stories drifted east, carried by travelers along the Red Sea and through the markets of Thebes and Alexandria, they mingled with Persian imagination. The idea of the spoken word as creation, that to tell was to make real, entered Middle Eastern thought like a seed carried on the wind. Centuries later, when Shahrazad would whisper her first words to the sleepless king, she was practicing that same ancient magic, healing through language, saving through story. But the Egyptian influence reached even deeper. Their scribes had developed one of the oldest forms of written fiction, moral allegories disguised as adventure. A humble peasant could argue his case before a corrupt judge and, through eloquence alone, triumph over injustice. The message was clear. The power of words could balance the scales of power itself. The Persian storytellers recognized the value of this. In a world ruled by emperors, a tale that could make the powerful listen was no small miracle. They began to refine their art until speech itself became diplomacy. A story could reprimand a tyrant without accusation, warn a ruler without rebellion. Wrapped in beauty, truth could survive where logic would be silenced. And so, as the Sassanid Empire flourished, its stories began to glow with the combined light of many suns: Mesopotamian longing, Egyptian mystery, Indian philosophy, and Persian grandeur. Around the royal fires, narrators spoke of jinn that served wise kings, of rivers that could talk, of gods who disguised themselves as merchants and beggars to test human virtue. These were not mere diversions. They were the collected dreams of civilizations, blended, refined, and passed from tongue to tongue. In the port cities of the Persian Gulf, sailors told of enchanted islands and sea monsters. In desert caravans, traders repeated tales of temples that vanished at dawn. Each story bore fragments of older myths, worn smooth by centuries of retelling, like pebbles carried down a river. It was in this mingling of voices that the DNA of the future Arabian Nights took form, not in a single land or language, but in the quiet recognition that all stories, everywhere, speak the same truth, that the human heart longs for meaning, even in chaos. By the time Islam's crescent rose above Arabia, the world of stories was already ancient. But the coming of a new faith would not destroy the old myths. Instead, it would preserve and transform them. For Islam, too, was a religion of words, of revelation spoken aloud, of poetry as proof of the divine. The transition from empire to caliphate, from fire temple to mosque, would soon reshape not only the politics of a region, but the very way stories were told. Yet the voices of the old gods did not vanish completely. They lingered in whispers, in the rustle of palm leaves, in the chants of wandering poets, in the faint pulse of memory carried by merchants and sailors across seas. Their presence would live on inside the tales to come, tales of jinn and flying horses, of wise men and doomed lovers. And when those stories were finally gathered under a single name, Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights, the voices of Mesopotamia and Egypt would still be there, echoing beneath the Arabic syllables like the hum of buried stars. The firelit halls of Persia had kindled the spark. The wisdom of India had given it form, but from the ruins of Babylon and the tombs of Egypt came its soul, the conviction that to tell a story is to create life itself. History rarely moves quietly. When the sands of Arabia began to stir in the 7th century, they carried with them a force that would change not only kingdoms, but ideas. A faith born in the voice of revelation, carried by men who believed that words could conquer where swords could not. Within a single century, the new Islamic world stretched from the shores of Spain to the edge of India. Yet, for all its speed, This conquest was not only of land, it was of knowledge. Unlike many empires before them, the Arabs did not erase the cultures they absorbed. They listened, they learned, they asked questions, and in the great cities they inherited, Alexandria, Ctesiphon, Jundashaper, they found libraries, scholars, and stories waiting to be reborn. The Persian scribes who had once written for fire-worshipping kings now turned their talents to the new rulers of faith. Greek philosophers, Indian mathematicians, and Persian physicians were invited to teach in the same halls. The caliphs understood that empires built on belief still needed the scaffolding of wisdom. And so, under their patronage, the translation movement began, an enterprise unlike anything the ancient world had seen. In the mid-8th century, when the Abbasid dynasty established its capital at Baghdad, the city rose from the desert like a vision, circular, immense, and radiant under the sun. Within a generation, it had become the beating heart of the world's knowledge. Merchants arrived from China, scholars from Byzantium, poets from Persia. Languages mingled like colors in glass. At the city's center stood the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, part library, part university, part sanctuary for ideas. Here, translators labored by oil light over crumbling manuscripts written in Sanskrit, Greek, Syriac, and Persian. Their task was monumental, to gather all the knowledge of the known world and render it into Arabic, the new lingua franca of civilization. It was not merely translation, it was transformation. The men of the House of Wisdom did not simply copy, they interpreted. They compared, commented, and expanded. When Aristotle's Poetics was translated, it was read alongside Persian and Indian aesthetics. When Greek astronomy arrived, it met Babylonian sky charts and Indian numerals. From this cross-pollination emerged a new kind of intellectual culture, analytical yet poetic, rational yet spiritual. Among the scrolls of medicine, mathematics, and philosophy, something else quietly entered the flow: stories. Indian fables, Persian chronicles, Greek romances, and Egyptian legends were all copied and retold in Arabic, sometimes reshaped, sometimes completely reborn. The storytellers of the Abbasid era began to weave these narratives into an ever-expanding fabric of entertainment and instruction. Arabic, supple and musical, became the perfect vessel for this exchange. It carried rhythm like a drumbeat, precision like a blade, and mystery like a dream. Through it, the wisdom of millennia was preserved and made new. But the House of Wisdom was more than a library. It was an idea, the belief that truth was not confined to one people or faith. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid, immortalized later as a character within the Arabian Nights itself, founded the institution as an act of devotion not only to Islam, but to the human intellect. He and his successors believed that the divine had given humans curiosity as a sacred duty. In their world, knowledge was worship. To read was a kind of prayer. The translators themselves became legends. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Christian scholar from Mesopotamia, learned Greek so thoroughly that he could render Galen's medical treatises into Arabic with poetic grace. The Persian philosopher Ibn al-Makaffa, who had translated Khalil wa Dimna, gave Arabic prose its first classical elegance, the kind of measured rhythm that would later echo in the voice of Shahrazad. The city that rose from the sands now pulsed with conversation. In its markets, sailors from India traded rubies beside booksellers offering Aristotle. In its gardens, poets recited lines comparing the moon to a lover's face, while astronomers calculated the orbit of Venus. And in its palaces, nobles listened to storytellers whose words carried the music of a dozen civilizations. From these voices, the Arabian Nights would one day be born, not as a single author's invention, but as the child of an empire that believed ideas were treasure. The stories that would fill the nights, of kings and demons, merchants and sailors, magic and love, were fragments of everything the House of Wisdom had preserved. They were Persian in heart, Indian in structure, Greek in logic, Egyptian in wonder, and Arabic in soul. As the centuries turned, this melting of myth and scholarship created something humanity had never seen before: a common language of imagination. From the Atlantic coast to the mountains of Central Asia, anyone who spoke Arabic could now share in the same stories, laugh at the same fables, cry for the same heroes. The world had become connected not just by trade, but by tale. When the translators of Baghdad finished their night's work, they would sometimes gather under lanterns and tell stories of their own, small fables born from fatigue and friendship. A few of those tales, whispered in jest among scholars, would travel far beyond them, carried by scribes and students, copied and recopied until they reached new cities. No one then could have guessed that those casual entertainments, those evening amusements of a civilization at its height, would one day circle the globe, surviving empires, religions, and languages. But perhaps they knew, in their hearts, that words, once spoken into the world, never truly vanish. They only wait to be found again. And so, as the caliphs slept in their marble palaces, the true empire of Islam expanded invisibly, not through war or conquest, but through ink, through memory, through the endless movement of stories. By day, Baghdad was a city of merchants and mathematicians, traders and teachers. But when the sun sank behind the domes of its mosques and the muezzin's calls faded into the warm dusk, another kind of commerce began, a trade in wonder. The markets did not sleep, they transformed. The scent of cardamom and roasting lamb drifted through narrow alleys, and the hum of conversation became the pulse of a civilization that lived through words. Under the soft glow of oil lamps, men gathered in coffee houses, a new invention that was reshaping the life of the city. Here, merchants discussed routes and profits, scholars debated philosophy, and travelers shared the newest gossip from distant lands. But above all, they came for the storytellers. The Akkad, as they were called, were professionals of memory and emotion. They wore long robes and turbans, carried staffs carved with verses, and possessed the most precious gift in the Islamic world, a trained voice. Some came from scholarly families and quoted lines of the Quran and Aristotle with equal grace. Others were illiterate wanderers who had learned their trade by listening at the doors of scholars or traveling with caravans. When the storyteller began, the noise of the marketplace softened into breathless silence. He did not merely recite, he performed. His hand rose and fell with rhythm. His eyes gleamed like lanterns. His tone shifted from thunder to whisper. With each gesture, he transported his listeners to another place. The court of a Persian king, the deck of a ship bound for Zanzibar, the shadowed tombs of Egypt, where jinn whispered beneath the earth. For these audiences, story was not luxury, it was necessity. It was how a society made sense of its fears and hopes, how it balanced the harshness of reality with the promise of meaning. In a world of shifting empires and uncertain fortunes, stories offered something permanent, an invisible architecture that gave life coherence. The storytellers were more than entertainers. They were custodians of collective memory. They preserved lineages, victories, and defeats. They carried legends from one generation to the next, reshaping them to fit the times. And they did it with a cunning that ensured their survival even under suspicious rulers. If a tale risked defending the powerful, it could always be said to have come from a faraway land. If a story carried dangerous truths, it could be hidden inside a fable about animals, merchants, or ghosts. Story became a form of camouflage, a moral lesson wrapped in delight. These public narrators also became psychologists before psychology existed. They understood that their listeners needed catharsis, laughter after fear, tenderness after grief. So they learned to pace their tales with care, alternating tragedy and comedy, truth and fantasy, until the crowd was bound to them by invisible thread. Some stories were endless, told in episodes that could stretch for weeks. The teller always stopped at the perfect moment, just before revelation, and when the audience begged for more, he would smile and say, "Tomorrow, if God wills." That phrase was not merely habit, it was the philosophy of their art, that every night's story depended on another dawn. Each cliffhanger kept the audience returning, each pause promised renewal. It was a performance of faith itself, that the sun would rise and the tale would continue. In time, these storytellers formed informal guilds. Apprentices learned by memorizing the classics, Persian epics, Indian fables, Greek romances, and the tales of prophets and saints. The best could weave these threads together seamlessly, creating a single continuous universe where Solomon's djinn might meet Alexander the Great, and a beggar might quote a philosopher. The storytellers' audiences were as diverse as their tales. Peasants and princes sat side by side, joined by the same curiosity. In an age without printing presses, these sessions were the people's library, a place where even the illiterate could inherit the wisdom of the world. Through these nightly performances, the scattered fragments of older civilizations began to fuse into something new. From Persia came the art of suspense. From India, the moral fable. From Greece, logic and dialogue. From Arabia, the rhythm of language itself. By combining them, the storytellers of Baghdad created a form that could contain everything: adventure, philosophy, politics, romance, and prayer. The tales of the Arabian Nights would later preserve this diversity like amber, capturing not one civilization, but all of them in motion. Coffee houses soon became more than social spaces. They were laboratories of imagination. Here, merchants tested new jokes, poets tried new verses, and storytellers measured which themes stirred hearts the most. When a story worked, it spread like wildfire, carried by travelers along the Silk Road, repeated in Cairo, Aleppo, Damascus, and Cordoba. In this way, the Arab world became the first truly global network of imagination. A story born in Baghdad might reach Morocco within a year, transformed with each telling, but still carrying its essence. The tales themselves were alive, constantly changing shape, always listening to their audiences. And so, by the time Shahrazad's name would first appear on parchment centuries later, her art was already ancient. She would not invent storytelling. She would refine it, distill 1,000 years of performance into one perfect act of survival. For now, the storytellers of Baghdad continued to fill the night with voices, prophets, tricksters, sultans, jinn, lovers. Each tale left the listeners changed, a little wiser, a little softer, a little more human. In the morning, the city would wake to trade, prayer, and the hum of the world. But at night, when the lamps were lit and the cups of coffee steamed, Baghdad became something greater than a city. It became a universe of words, a place where the human need to dream and understand met in perfect harmony. And from that harmony, a legend was preparing to be born. By the 9th century, the storytellers of Baghdad had mastered the art of wonder. They could make a merchant outsmart a demon, a beggar become a king, or a parrot reveal a secret that saved a life. But something new was beginning to take shape among the masters of the craft, a structure that would transform simple tales into something far greater, the story that contains all stories. It began with necessity. Audiences wanted more than endings. They wanted continuation. They didn't wish to leave the world of the tale once it was over. The storyteller, too, hungered for a form that could contain the endlessness of human experience. And so the frame was born, a story that could hold other stories within it, an architecture of mirrors where one voice could multiply into many. The earliest versions were simple. A traveler would arrive at an inn and tell a tale to pass the night. His tale might feature another traveler who would tell his own, and so on, each story opening a door into another. The audience, hypnotized by this infinite regression, soon forgot where it had begun. It was like standing in a hall of reflections, each story showing a new face of the same truth. But the technique was more than an artistic flourish. It was a form of protection. In an age when truth could be dangerous, storytellers learned that a frame could shield both teller and tale. A political criticism could be disguised as a fable told by a fisherman. A theological question could hide inside a parrot's confession. I did not say this, the narrator could claim. It was the traveler in my story who said it. In a world of rulers and clerics, such distance was a matter of survival. The frame also offered something more profound, a way to express the endlessness of meaning. If a story can contain another story, and that story yet another, then truth itself has no boundaries. It suggests that wisdom cannot be captured in a single tale, just as life cannot be understood through a single moment. Everything leads to something deeper, if only one keeps listening. The Persian compilers had experimented with the form earlier in works like Hazar Afsan, The Thousand Stories. But it was in the cosmopolitan swirl of Abbasid Baghdad that the structure reached maturity. Scribes began to record entire collections, where one narrator told dozens of tales to a royal audience, each story offering pleasure and instruction, each ending in suspense. From these experiments, a new kind of literature emerged, one that mirrored life itself, cyclical, unfinished, ever-renewing. The scholars of the House of Wisdom noticed it too. Philosophers saw in the nested story a metaphor for divine creation, worlds within worlds, each reflecting the one above it. Mystics saw in it the pattern of the soul's journey, the seeker entering one mystery after another, never reaching the final truth, because the final truth is infinite. But it was the Hakawadis, the professional storytellers of the streets, who perfected it. They realized that a frame could bind an audience to the teller night after night. They could begin with one scene, a king, a question, a promise, and from that opening, unfold 1,000 possibilities. Each dawn, they could stop at the edge of revelation, forcing the listener to return. It was narrative turned into ritual, a performance of suspense itself. Soon, this method spread through the Islamic world. In Cairo and Damascus, storytellers began framing entire collections around a single conversation, a judge listening to a thief, a caliph listening to a poet, a wise woman instructing her daughter. These frames gave the tales coherence and emotional depth. The storyteller was no longer an invisible voice. He, or sometimes she, became a living participant in the drama. It is here, in this evolution, that the seed of Shahrazad first took root. The idea of a woman who tells stories, not merely for amusement, but for survival. She would be both narrator and character, both artist and subject, and her stories would not only entertain, but transform the one who listened. In these early centuries, the storytellers could not have known that their innovations would one day give birth to one of the greatest narrative devices in human history, the endless night of storytelling that would save a life and define a civilization. Yet something in their craft already sensed it. They were discovering the narrative equivalent of breath, a rhythm of anticipation and release, death and reprieve. The framed tale was more than structure, it was philosophy. It implied that life itself is a series of stories within stories, that every person's fate is connected to another's, and that no story ever truly ends. A tale might close, but its echoes continue in the next, like waves folding over one another on the sea. When the first compilers began gathering the great collections of Arabic tales, the Thousand Stories, the Book of the Parrot, the Seven Viziers, they used this device as both anchor and compass. Each narrator told stories that reflected upon the frame itself, so that fiction and reality became inseparable. The listener could not tell whether the storyteller was describing another world or quietly describing their own. That uncertainty, that blur between art and life, was what gave the form its enduring power. And so, by the 10th century, the stage was set, the tools were ready, the storyteller's voice, the audience's hunger, the moral heartbeat of fables, and the infinite ladder of frames. All that remained was for someone to use them not merely to delight, but to heal. And when she finally came, the woman who would tell stories to postpone her own death, she would find that her craft had already been waiting for her for 1,000 years. By the time the art of storytelling reached its greatest refinement in Baghdad, far to the east another court had begun to rot from within. The kingdom of King Shahryar was one of immense wealth, a realm of marble palaces, jeweled pavilions, and gardens watered by silver fountains. Yet beneath the glittering surface, something dark pulsed and waited. The ruler's armies were undefeated, his treasuries overflowed, but within his own heart, a quiet fever had begun to spread. one that no physician could cure. It began, as most tragedies do, not with politics or war, but with love. For years, Shahryar had trusted his queen completely. She was said to be wise as well as beautiful, capable of calming his temper with a single glance. He had given her everything a mortal woman could desire: palaces, attendants, silks from China, pearls from the Indian Ocean, perfumes from Yemen. Yet one spring morning, when he returned unexpectedly from a distant campaign, he found her in the palace gardens, laughing with a slave. The laughter cut deeper than any blade. In that instant, the entire structure of his world, loyalty, faith, divine justice, cracked apart. What he saw was not merely betrayal. It was, to him, the collapse of meaning itself. If the woman he trusted most could deceive him so easily, what truth remained anywhere? The punishment was immediate and terrible. The queen and her lover were executed before the court, their bodies displayed as a warning. But the execution brought no peace. Instead, the king's mind fractured. He began to see treachery everywhere, in the eyes of his courtiers, the whispers of servants, the smiles of women passing in the courtyard. He became convinced that faithlessness was not an exception but the rule, that women, by nature, were deceitful, and that only death could prevent betrayal. Thus began the ritual. Each evening, the king would summon a virgin from among his subjects. She would be dressed in bridal finery, led to the royal chambers, and by dawn, executed. No explanation was needed. Her innocence was irrelevant. The king's logic was unassailable in its madness. If every woman must one day betray, better to destroy her before she has the chance. The kingdom entered an age of mourning. Families fled the capital with their daughters. Markets grew silent. Musicians refused to play. The once luminous court of Shahryar became a mausoleum of silks and blood. The air smelled of incense and fear. Only one man could not escape his duty: the vizier, the king's chief minister and the reluctant architect of this horror. It fell to him to select the victims, to knock upon the doors of trembling homes, and deliver the royal summons no father could bear to hear. Each choice eroded his soul a little more. Yet disobedience meant death for his entire family. Each dawn, the vizier would wash the blood from his hands, offer prayer, and wonder how long before it was his own daughters who would be taken. And then one evening, his eldest child, Shahrazad, came to him with a request that made him drop the scroll from his hands. She wished to marry the king. The vizier thought she had gone mad. He begged, threatened, pleaded, but she stood unmoved, calm as the moon. Her education had been unusual. She had read the ancient epics of Persia, the wisdom texts of India, the philosophy of Greece, the mystical writings of the Jews. But most of all, she understood stories. She knew what they could do, how they could shape the mind, soothe the soul, or open the eyes of those blinded by pain. Her plan was simple and impossible. She would marry Shahryar, and she would live, not by pleading for mercy, but by telling him stories. To her father's horror, she explained that she would not face the king as a victim, but as a healer. "He has forgotten what it means to listen," she said, "so I will make him listen, night after night, until he remembers that human hearts are not made for killing." Her younger sister, Dunyazad, became her secret ally. The two devised a plan of astonishing precision. On the wedding night, when the king had taken his pleasure and prepared to sleep, Dunyazad would ask softly, "Sister, tell me one of your wondrous tales to pass this sleepless night, if our lord the king permits." Shahrazad would bow and begin to speak, humbly, reverently, weaving her voice through the candlelight like a spell. Her stories would begin not with arguments or sermons, but with wonder. A merchant and a genie, a fisherman and a brass vessel, a king who learned mercy from a beggar. Each tale would carry a lesson hidden beneath its silken folds. Each would end at dawn, just before the climax, forcing the king to postpone her death for one more day. The vizier trembled as he listened to her plan. "He will kill you," he whispered. "You cannot reason with grief turned to stone." But Shahrazad only smiled. Stories are older than kings, she said, and stronger than death. The following night, the palace burned with candlelight as the doomed bride was brought before the king. She did not tremble. She did not weep. She bowed low, and when the hour grew late, and Dunyazad whispered her cue, Shahrazad began to speak, not to save her life, but to awaken another soul. Her voice rose softly through the dark chamber, carrying with it the weight of 1,000 years of human storytelling, from Persian courts and Indian temples, from Babylonian tablets and Egyptian scrolls, all converging in this single moment. And thus began the first of 1,000 nights, the night when narrative itself became an act of survival. The night air in Shahyar's chamber was heavy with silence. Only the faint hiss of the oil lamps marked the passage of time. The king lay against his pillows, expression unreadable, while Shahrazad sat at the foot of the bed, her sister beside her, when Dunyazad whispered her rehearsed plea. "Sister, tell me one of your wondrous tales to pass the night, if our lord the king permits." Shahrazad bowed low, her voice trembling just enough to sound human, not defiant. "If the king allows," she said softly, "I will tell a tale of justice and mercy." Shahyar waved a hand without interest. "Speak," he said, "and at dawn you shall die." But her words began to weave something in the air, a rhythm, a slow current that pulled his mind away from blood and memory toward curiosity. "There was once a merchant," she began, "a man of wealth and good repute, who traveled through deserts and distant lands. One day, as he rested beneath a palm and ate dates, he cast away their pits, and one pit struck an unseen being. A genie appeared in a storm of smoke, declaring, 'By this act you have killed my son, and for that you must die.' The king's eyes flicked toward her. In terror, the merchant begged for mercy. 'It was an accident,' he cried. 'Would you slay a man for what he did not intend?' But the genie's rage could not be soothed. The merchant asked only for one mercy, a year to set his affairs in order, to bid farewell to his family and repay his debts. The genie, bound by his own code of honor, granted the request. A year passed. True to his word, the merchant returned to the same spot, carrying his shroud, prepared to meet death. But as he waited, 3 old men appeared, each leading a strange creature, one a gazelle, one 2 black dogs, and one a mule. Seeing the merchant's sorrow, they asked his tale, and when he finished, each said, 'If you allow, we will tell our own stories to the genie, and see if we may win 1/3 of your blood.' Here Shahrazad paused. The silence deepened. Even the king's breath slowed. The genie appeared in a wind that shook the earth. 'Prepare to die,' he thundered. But the first old man stepped forward. 'O mighty spirit,' he said, 'if I tell you a tale stranger than what you have heard, will you grant me a share of this man's life?' The genie agreed. So the first man told a story of a wife who had turned his son into a gazelle and his mistress into a cow through sorcery, of a shepherd who revealed the truth and restored his son's human form, of the justice that followed when love triumphed over deceit. When the story ended, the genie, moved by wonder, said, 'You have earned 1/3 of this man's blood.' Then the second old man began his tale. Shahrazad let her voice trail off like a strand of smoke, fading into silence. The king frowned. 'Why do you stop?' he asked. She bowed her head. 'Because dawn is near, my lord. If I continue, I may weary you.' The faintest glimmer of curiosity crossed his face, the first human expression she had seen since entering his chamber. 'Very well,' he said. 'Tomorrow night you will finish it.' And for the first time in 3 years, a dawn arrived without an execution. The next evening, when the lamps were lit and the moon rode high above the palace domes, the ritual began again. Dunyazad asked for a story. Shahrazad resumed. 'The second old man told of his brothers,' she said, 'who betrayed him out of envy. They destroyed his ships, stole his fortune, and cast him into the sea. But by the grace of fate, he was rescued, and through wisdom and patience he regained all that he had lost, proving that betrayal, though painful, cannot destroy the righteous man.' Shahyar's eyes narrowed at that word betrayal, but he said nothing. The Jinnee, pleased with this tale, spared another third of the merchant's life. Then came the third old man, whose story of loyalty and sacrifice so moved the Jinnee that he forgave the merchant entirely. "Take your life back," he said. "You have shown me that not all mortals are unjust." And with that, the Jinnee vanished, leaving the merchant alive, wiser, humbler, and free. When she finished, Shahrazad folded her hands and bowed. The chamber fell silent. The king sat motionless for a long time. Then, with a slow exhale, he said, "Another night." It was not an order of death, but of continuation. As days turned to weeks, Shahrazad learned to read the currents of his mind as she once read books. Some nights she chose tales of kings who learned compassion, on others, of women whose loyalty was misjudged. Each story was a mirror, reflecting fragments of his own soul back at him, but gently, indirectly, wrapped in magic and metaphor. The court, too, began to change. The executioner's block gathered dust. The servants whispered in disbelief. The city's musicians began to play again, softly at first, then boldly, as hope crept back into their hearts. And the king, who had once ruled through terror, now found himself waiting for the sound of a woman's voice. What had begun as a performance for survival had become a nightly ritual of awakening, a slow rebirth through the oldest art known to humankind, the telling of stories. By the second month of her long vigil, Shahrazad knew her audience as well as any healer knows a wound. The king's rage no longer flared like lightning. It smoldered, watchful, uncertain. Each evening he listened longer before interrupting. Sometimes he even asked questions, cautious, probing. And so, one night, when Dunyazad whispered for another tale, Shahrazad began the story that would test the king's heart more deeply than any before. The Fisherman and the Brass Vessel. "There once lived a fisherman," she said, "poor but honest, who cast his net into the sea 4 times each day. For it was written that no man should tempt fate more often. 3 times he drew up nothing but broken glass and scraps of iron. On the 4th, his net came up heavy, too heavy, and when he pulled, he found a brass vessel sealed with the signet of King Solomon, peace be upon him. The fisherman marveled. 'Perhaps it holds treasure,' he said. But when he pried it open, a cloud of black smoke poured forth, rising until it blotted out the sun, and from the smoke took shape a mighty Jinnee, whose head touched the clouds and whose eyes burned like molten gold. 'Mortal,' the spirit roared, 'prepare to die. For so long have I suffered in this prison that I swore to kill whoever freed me.' The fisherman fell to his knees. 'O Lord of fire and wind,' he cried, 'what crime have I committed? I have given you freedom.' The Jinnee sneered. 'When Solomon first bound me, I swore to reward whoever released me. But centuries passed and none came. In the first 100 years, I vowed to grant gold. In the second, power. In the third, wisdom. But when 1,000 years had passed, I despaired and swore instead that I would kill whoever freed me, that my vengeance would be my only joy.' The fisherman trembled. Yet even in terror, his mind remained sharp. 'O mighty Jinnee,' he said, 'you claim you were sealed in this bottle, yet you fill the sky. How can such a thing be true?' The spirit, stung by pride, laughed. 'You doubt my power.' 'Indeed I do,' said the fisherman. 'No bottle, however vast, could hold your great bulk.' The Jinnee, eager to prove himself, dissolved again into smoke and poured into the vessel. And when the last wisp had entered, the fisherman clapped the lid shut and sealed it with Solomon's mark once more. 'Stay there,' he said, 'until you learn gratitude.' For hours the Jinnee pleaded for release, promising mercy, but the fisherman was cautious. He made the spirit swear by the Most High to harm no living being, and only then did he open the vessel again. Freed, the Jinnee kept his oath and led the fisherman to a hidden lake. 'Here,' he said, 'cast your net, and you will find fish like no other.' The man obeyed, and when he drew up his net, there were 4 fish, each of a different color, red, blue, yellow, and white, glimmering like jewels. He brought them to the palace of the local sultan. who ordered his cook to prepare them. But as the fish sizzled in the pan, a voice cried out from a wall, "Spare us, O cook, for we were once men." The cook fled in terror, and when the Sultan arrived, he too heard the voices. Guided by the fisherman, he followed the trail to a distant, ruined city where all the people were turned to stone, save for one young man, half marble from the waist down. The prince told his story, that he had once ruled this city, but his wife, a powerful sorceress, had betrayed him and taken a lover. When he discovered her deceit, his anger had turned to vengeance, and in her wrath, she had cursed him, turning him half to stone and transforming his people into fish, each color representing a different quarter of the city. For years he had lived thus, half alive, half dead, his body frozen, his heart full of grief. The Sultan, moved by pity and wisdom, vowed to set things right. He waited for the sorceress to visit her paralyzed husband. Disguised as a young man, he spoke gently to her, learned the secret of her magic, and used her own spell to reverse it. In a flash, the city returned to life. The prince's legs were restored, and the sorceress was undone by her own cruelty. When Shahrazad finished, the candles had burned low. The king sat very still. "A wife betrays her husband," he said slowly, "and yet he does not kill her at once." Shahrazad bowed her head. He sought understanding first, "My lord." He learned that vengeance, without comprehension, turns kingdoms to stone. The king said nothing, but his hand, which had rested upon the hilt of his dagger, fell away. That night marked a turning point. The tale's image of the half-marble prince haunted him. He saw himself reflected there, alive in mind, but dead in heart, ruler of a kingdom silenced by his own rage. He lay awake long after Shahrazad's voice had faded, seeing not her face, but the petrified city. The whisper of her final line echoed in his thoughts. Only those who forgive can awaken the stone. When dawn came, he did not summon the executioner, and outside the palace walls, in the streets of the city that had known only fear, people began to whisper the unthinkable, that perhaps the killing had stopped. When evening fell again over the marble palaces of the capital, the king waited before speaking. He had eaten little that day, had walked long through the echoing halls of his court, and now, as the lamps were lit, his expression carried not fury but unease. Something had begun to stir beneath the armor of his certainty. He looked at Shahrazad. "The fisherman's tale is not finished," he said quietly. "Tell me what became of that city." She bowed. "As the king commands." "The sultan who freed the prince," she began, did not rejoice at his own cleverness. He looked upon the ruins and the frightened people restored from stone, and he said, "Let us not praise vengeance, but the patience that undid it." The young prince wept, for the spell that had bound his body had bound his heart as well. He had spent years hating his wife, wishing her endless torment, but now, seeing her destroyed by her own magic, he felt no triumph, only weariness. "My lord," he said, "what am I now to do with this city? Half of us remember nothing but fear. The other half remembers only rage." And the Sultan answered, "Begin again. Forgive the dead, and teach the living to build anew." Then he turned to the fisherman and said, "You cast your net into the sea, and drew up more than fish. You drew up a lesson, that even what is lost beneath the waves can be brought to light again." He gave the poor man gold, not as reward for service, but as acknowledgement that truth often comes from those without crowns or titles. And when the fisherman walked home, the road behind him seemed to shimmer with the first light of dawn. Shahrazad's voice fell silent for a time, the stories ending hovering in the air like a feather that refused to land. Shahryar stared into the shadows. "You speak of patience," he said at last, "and of forgiveness. But tell me, storyteller, what man forgives a wife who betrays him? What ruler forgets treachery?" Her gaze met his, calm and unwavering. "None forget, my lord," she answered. "But those who rule must choose whether to be governed by memory or by wisdom." The fisherman could not destroy the sea because one wave had nearly drowned him. The king said nothing more, but when the dawn broke over the city, the executioner remained at rest. In the days that followed, whispers moved through the court, like wind through curtains. The guards at the palace gate spoke quietly among themselves. No new brides had been summoned. The vizier, gaunt and sleepless, watched the change with disbelief. Could the nightmare truly be ending? Each night, the storyteller returned to the chamber with fresh wonder, and though the king's expression remained stern, a strange thing began to happen. He listened. He truly listened. He began to hear the world again. The rustle of servants, the soft murmur of musicians in the courtyard, the sound of his own breath. For 3 years, these things had existed without meaning. Now they returned, one by one, like exiles coming home. The tale of the four-colored fish had planted something deeper than curiosity. It had stirred an ache he could neither name nor dismiss. He began to walk among his gardens again, not to command, but to see. The marble fountains no longer looked like frozen tears, and the sound of water no longer mocked him with memories of loss. He watched birds gather at the pool, saw the play of light upon their wings, and thought, I have been stoned for too long. When he returned to Shahrazad that night, he said nothing of these thoughts, but she saw the change in his eyes, the faint flicker of reflection that precedes repentance. And so, she began a new tale, one that would carry the lesson further, wrapping it in laughter and strangeness so that it might take root without resistance. She told of 3 travelers who met in a city where everyone was blind at noon and sighted only at night, of a prince who sought justice so earnestly he forgot compassion, of a merchant who tried to weigh forgiveness on a scale. Each story carried the same hidden pulse, the truth that mercy is not weakness, but strength refined by sorrow. When her voice finally faded, the king sat in stillness. The first light of morning spilled across the silken floor, catching the edge of the dagger that always lay beside his bed. He reached for it, but instead of drawing it, he turned it over, blade downward, and left it there. Outside, in the waking streets of the capital, the women of the city heard the palace bells ring not for mourning, but for prayer. For the first time in years, their sound was clean and bright, like the breaking of a spell. And in the silence that followed, Shahrazad knew her wager was working. Each tale was not merely delaying death, it was remaking a soul. The king had begun to sleep again, not the shallow rest of exhaustion, but the kind that arrives after a mind has made its first peace with memory. When Shahrazad entered his chamber that night, she found him waiting, the lamps already lit, the daggers put away. He said nothing, only nodded for her to begin. And so she spoke, her voice slow as water. Tonight, my lord, I will tell you of a night much like this one, when 3 wandering dervishes, each blind in one eye, came upon a great house in the city of Baghdad. Inside they found 3 beautiful women who lived without masters, servants, or husbands, yet whose faces carried the gravity of queens. The dervishes, she said, were travelers from distant lands. They had been scholars, merchants, princes, men who had lost everything but their faith. The house they entered gleamed with lamps and laughter. The women welcomed them, fed them, offered wine and music, and declared one rule: you may ask nothing of what you see, and speak no question of what we do. If you obey, you shall be our guests and our friends. But if curiosity overcomes you, our hospitality will end. It was a strange bargain, yet hunger silences prudence. The men agreed, and so the feast began. There was dancing, poetry, and conversation that hovered between the sacred and the absurd. But as the night deepened, the travelers noticed things that defied understanding. Chains of gold that hung from the ceiling yet bound nothing. Shadows that moved where no person stood. Tears on the cheeks of women who smiled as though content. Curiosity gnawed at them like rats in the dark. When the first dervish asked about the tears, the eldest lady only said, "Ask no more, for some questions carry their own punishments." Still, he persisted, and so she sighed and told her tale. She had been a princess once, married to a prince whose love was purer until envy twisted it. He listened to whispers that she was unfaithful, though she had done no wrong. In his rage, he struck her, cursed her, and drove her from the court. She wandered until her beauty faded into sorrow and her laughter turned to silence. The two younger women were her sisters, bound by loyalty and shame to share her exile. The chains that hung in their house, she explained, were the invisible bonds of guilt and grief, never heavy enough to crush them, but impossible to break. The dervishes fell silent, ashamed. The second dervish then spoke his own confession. He had been a prince too. One day, while exploring the corridors of his palace, he discovered a hidden door marked "Do Not Enter." Curiosity, he said, is a fire that asks only for breath. He opened it. Behind the door was a woman of unearthly beauty, imprisoned by an evil spirit who loved her and punished her captors. The dervish tried to free her, and in doing so lost an eye, a kingdom, and his peace. I learned then, he said, that not all prisons have walls, and not all chains are visible. The king listened without blinking. These were no longer simple tales to him. They were parables of his own heart. He saw in the First Lady's unjust punishment his own cruelty toward the innocent. In the dervish's forbidden door, he saw his own obsession with betrayal, his own need to know the worst rather than trust the good. Shahrazad continued. As dawn approached in the tale, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid himself appeared at the women's door, disguised as a common traveler. He listened to their stories, recognized their nobility, and revealed his identity. But instead of punishing them for deceit or pride, he honored their endurance and granted them restoration. The sisters were returned to their palace. The dervishes were given new stations in the court, and the city rejoiced in mercy rather than judgment. Here Shahrazad paused. The king sat motionless. The sound of the fountain outside the window marked a silence, like a heartbeat. At the end, she said softly, the Caliph said, "We are all wanderers in search of the door that leads back to trust." The king looked down at his hands, and when he found it, he asked. Shahrazad smiled faintly. He learned that some doors open only when we stop demanding what lies behind them. A long silence followed. Then Shahryar rose, walked to the window, and drew aside the curtain. Outside, the city of his reign shimmered under moonlight, alive once more with distant voices, merchants closing stalls, the faint hum of a living world he had forgotten. He turned to her. "Tomorrow night," he said, "you will tell me another." And so the execution ceased for yet another dawn. Hope began to grow again in the streets of Baghdad. The women of the city, hearing whispers from the palace, dared to light candles in their windows once more. A quiet gesture of faith that the king who had destroyed so many lives might, through the voice of one woman, be finding his own. By now, the king had become a man who awaited the night with anticipation rather than dread. The chamber that once smelled of fear now carried the faint scent of myrrh and lamp oil, and the silence between Shahrazad's words was filled not with tension, but with thought. She had taught him wonder, and then compassion. Now she would teach him laughter, not the cruel laughter of conquest, but the kind that restores balance to a soul too long weighed down by grief. So when Dunyazad whispered her nightly cue, Shahrazad smiled and began. "Tonight, my lord, I will tell you of the hunchback, whose death was both tragic and absurd, and whose story proved that sometimes the wisest judge is laughter itself. There was once," she said, "a tailor in the city of Baghdad who invited a hunchbacked entertainer to dine with him and his wife. The little man was a delight, singing, joking, and telling tales until the household rang with joy. But as he swallowed a mouthful of fish, a bone lodged in his throat. He fell dead upon the floor. The tailor and his wife rose in horror. To be found with a corpse in one's house was a sentence of death. And so, in their panic, they carried the hunchback's body through the dark streets and left it leaning against the door of a Jewish physician. When the doctor awoke and saw the figure slumped in his doorway, he thought it a drunken beggar. He shook the body, and it fell lifeless to the floor. Certain he would be accused of murder, the physician hurriedly carried the corpse to the house of a Muslim steward, leaving it propped upright against the wall. Moments later, the steward returned home in the dark, stumbled over the hunchback, and, believing he was being attacked, struck him with a stick, killing him a second time, or so he thought. Now he too panicked and passed the corpse to yet another house, where the same cycle of confusion continued. By dawn, The dead man had been murdered half a dozen times, though only once in truth. The king frowned, uncertain whether to laugh. Shahrazad smiled faintly, reading his doubt. "Patience, my lord," she said. "The story is not finished." The following morning, she continued, the city watch discovered the body and began an investigation. Each man accused the next. Each told a tale more elaborate than the last. At last, the matter came before the Sultan, who, hearing so many absurd confessions, declared, "Never have I seen death wander so much in one night." He ordered that each accused person tell his story in full before any judgment could be made. And as each spoke, the court burst into laughter, for though their deeds were foolish, their fear was universal. The Sultan, weeping from laughter, finally pardoned them all, saying, "If one death can teach so many the limits of their reason, let this hunchback serve as our teacher." And the corpse, poor victim of coincidence, was given a splendid burial, not as a tragedy, but as a saint of folly. The king's lips twitched. Then, to Shahrazad's quiet astonishment, he laughed, a real laugh, low and rough at first, but growing freer, warmer. For a moment, the sound startled even him. It had been years since laughter had escaped his throat. When it faded, he said softly, "Your tale is foolish, and yet it feels true. We are all these men, are we not? Passing our guilt from one to another, hoping someone else will bear it." Shahrazad inclined her head. "Yes, my lord. The tale reminds us that justice, without understanding, is as blind as panic. Sometimes, laughter reveals truth more clearly than punishment ever could." The king sat back in silence, his face softened by thought. That night, the laughter spread. From the royal chamber to the corridors beyond, servants heard it and stared in disbelief. The next day, when Shahyar passed through the palace courtyard, a child playing with a hoop stumbled before him and dropped it at his feet. In the old days, such clumsiness would have earned a blow. Now, the king picked up the hoop, handed it back, and said, "Be careful, little one, lest your hoop be mistaken for a hunchback's ghost." The guards did not understand the joke, but they smiled because he did. For Shahrazad, this night marked a quiet triumph. She had taught him that not all truth comes robed in solemnity. That laughter, too, could heal. That it could make even a ruler see how fragile his judgments were. The sword that had hung over her head for so many months no longer gleamed with threat, but with reflection. And yet she knew her task was not complete. To heal the wound fully, she would need to lead him deeper still, into the realm where power and mercy met, where kings learned to rule not by fear, but by wisdom. Outside, dawn crept across the city, and though the people still whispered in awe at their sovereign's transformation, none knew the truth of what was happening within those lamplit walls, that a woman's voice, armed only with words, had done what armies could not. She had conquered vengeance with stories, and her victory had only begun. By now, the palace had begun to breathe again. Servants moved through its halls without fear of the morning bell. Children's laughter floated faintly from the courtyards. Even the vizier, Shahrazad's father, who had once walked each day like a man carrying his own coffin, found himself pausing in astonishment at the sound of music returning to the royal wing. But Shahrazad knew that peace built on habit was fragile. If the king's heart was to heal completely, he would have to learn not only empathy and humor, but the art of wise governance. So that night, as dusk deepened and the last call to prayer faded from the city, she began a new cycle, one of rulers and counsel, justice and folly. There once was a young prince, she said, who inherited a throne before he had learned how to rule. He was clever and brave, but impatient, and his court was filled with men who flattered him, saying, "Your will is wisdom, your anger is law." One day, a rival noble was accused of treason. The prince, believing the evidence obvious, ordered the man's execution before sunset. But an old vizier stepped forward and said, "My lord, every hasty judgment is a blade swung in the dark. Allow me 7 days, and I will tell you 7 stories. If, after hearing them, you still desire the man's death, I will carry out the order myself." The prince, curious, agreed. The first story, The Falcon and the King. The vizier told of a king who once rode through the desert, thirsty and proud. His falcon, trained to fetch water, filled its cup from a spring and brought it to his master. But when the king raised the cup, the bird knocked it away. 3 times this happened, and the king, furious, drew his dagger and struck the falcon dead. Only then did he climb to the spring and find, floating on its surface, a dead serpent, its venom mingling with the water he would have drunk. "O king," the vizier said, "you are that rider. Do not kill what you do not understand." The prince listened uneasy, but said, "A single story cannot redeem a traitor." And so, the next day, the vizier told another. The second story, The Pearl and the Pebble. A merchant once found 2 stones on the shore, one dull, one radiant. He sold the dull stone and became rich, for within it lay a hidden pearl. But the bright one was worthless glass. He who judges by the surface, my lord, trades wisdom for pride. The prince frowned. Are all crimes illusions, then? The vizier bowed. No, my lord, but every illusion begs to be examined. For 7 days and 7 nights, the vizier wove his counsel through story. He told of a judge who condemned a thief only to discover the stolen goods had been his own forgotten property. He told of a fisherman who spared a poisonous eel, only to find it later saved him from drowning. He told of a gardener who destroyed a weed, not knowing it sheltered the roots of his most beautiful flower. Each story peeled another layer from the prince's certainty, and on the 7th day, when the executioner came to await his order, the young ruler said, "If a single story can alter a life, how can a single accusation end one?" He freed the nobleman and made the vizier his chief advisor. His reign became long and just, and the kingdom flourished in peace. When Shahrazad fell silent, the king said nothing for a long time. The candles had burned low, their wicks trembling in the quiet. Then he spoke softly. So the vizier saved a life by speaking 7 nights. And you, Shahrazad, how many lives have you saved by speaking 1,000? She lowered her gaze. Only one, my lord. But sometimes, saving one soul saves a kingdom. The words struck him deeper than any blade could. That night, Shahryar could not sleep. He rose before dawn and walked alone through the corridors. At every doorway he passed, the kitchen, the guardhouse, the courtyards, he saw faces that had once avoided his gaze now bow in quiet respect. He remembered how easily he had condemned, how quickly his wrath had felt like justice. Now, every shadow in the palace seemed to whisper the vizier's warning. Do not kill what you do not understand. When morning came, he summoned his counselors and decreed a new law. From this day forth, no punishment shall be carried out in my realm until the accused has spoken, and the truth been sought from every side. For the sword that strikes too soon may cut the hand that wields it. The court stood in stunned silence. Then the vizier, Shahrazad's father, fell to his knees and wept. That evening, when Shahrazad returned, the king greeted her not with command, but with gratitude. "You have taught me to laugh," he said, "and now you have taught me to wait. But tell me, what comes after patience?" She smiled. "After patience, my lord, comes compassion, and for that, I have another story." The night wind swept gently through the palace garden, carrying the scent of jasmine and river water. The moon hung low above the domes of Baghdad, bright enough to silver the marble courtyards, where servants once whispered only of executions. Now they spoke of peace. In the royal chamber, Shahryar sat beside the open window, watching the reflection of the moon ripple across a basin of still water. When Shahrazad entered, he did not look up immediately. "You said last night," he murmured, "that after patience comes compassion. But can compassion tame desire? Can it quiet the hunger that drives men to ruin?" Shahrazad bowed her head. "Perhaps not quiet it, my lord," she said softly, "but it can teach us what that hunger truly seeks." Then she began her next tale. "There once lived a prince in Yemen," she said, "young, bold, and endlessly curious. On the feast of his father's birthday, 3 foreign sages came to the court, each bearing a wondrous gift. The first offered a mirror that showed not faces but hearts. The second presented an ivory tube that could hear conversations across the world. The third unveiled a strange, shining horse carved from ebony and silver gears that could fly through the air if one knew its secret. The first two gifts amazed the court, but it was the stone horse that seized the prince's imagination. "How does it fly?" he asked. "By wisdom," the third sage said, "and by restraint." But the prince, drunk with wonder, mounted the horse before learning the secret. He pressed the wrong lever, and the creature soared into the sky, faster than any wind. He rose above mountains, above clouds, until the world below became a painted map. Panic struck. He had no idea how to descend. The king leaned forward, his eyes gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Did he fall? "Not yet," Shahrazad replied. He prayed, wept, and then, by accident, pressed another lever. The horse spiraled down, landing in a strange kingdom bathed in gold. There he found a palace, and within it, a princess asleep in a garden of silver trees. She was so beautiful that the prince thought he had entered paradise itself. He waited until she woke, and when she saw him, a stranger from the sky, she thought him a spirit of destiny. They spoke, and soon love, that oldest of enchantments, wove itself around them both. But love built on awe is a fragile thing. The prince forgot that he had trespassed into another man's kingdom. When the princess's father discovered him, he was seized, chained, and condemned as a sorcerer. For months he languished in prison, dreaming of the sky, of the girl, and of the horse he had lost. Then one night, he heard a sound like thunder above the palace. Looking up through the bars, he saw the glint of the stone horse, still circling, waiting. The prince cried out, "If you have a soul, save me now." And the horse, obeying the memory of its first rider, descended. He escaped in darkness, carrying the princess with him. But as they rose again into the heavens, the prince saw his reflection in the mirror of the moon and realized he had stolen what was not his to keep. His desire had brought both wonder and ruin. So he turned the horse toward home. There he presented the princess to his father and said, "Let her be free. My flight has ended." He locked the horse away, vowing never to ride it again until he had learned to master not the machine, but himself. Shahrazad fell silent. For a long moment, only the fountain outside filled the space between them. Then Shahryar said quietly, "He gave up the very thing that made him extraordinary." "Perhaps," Shahrazad answered, "but in doing so, he discovered what made him human." The king rose, walked to the window, and stared at the moon's trembling reflection. "When I was young," he said, "I thought desire was a horse, strong, swift, mine to command. Now I see it was the rider that commanded me." Shahrazad's voice softened. "Even kings, my lord, must learn when to dismount." That night, the king dreamed of flight, not on wings of vengeance or fear, but of peace. He dreamed of soaring over his city, not as ruler, but as guardian. And when he awoke, the dawn light spilled across his bed like gold, and for the first time in years, he smiled at it. Outside, the fountains ran clear, the air was filled with birdsong, and the people whispered that the curse upon their king's soul had lifted a little more. The dawn after the tale of the stone horse arrived clear in gold, washing the palace in quiet light. No blood stained the courtyard straw, no footsteps of the executioner echoed in the halls. Instead, the sound of sweeping, of laughter, of the morning call to prayer drifted through the royal windows. And yet, in the king's heart, another question had begun to stir, one deeper than mercy, sharper than guilt. If compassion could heal wounds, and wisdom could temper anger, then what of power itself? Could a ruler wield it without corruption? Could control exist without cruelty? That night, as the moon climbed pale over Baghdad, Shahrazad saw this new restlessness in his eyes. She bowed slightly and said, "Then tonight, my lord, let us speak of a prince who found the very key to all power, and almost lost his soul because of it." "There was once," she began, "a prince who ruled a coastal city renowned for its beauty and faith. His people loved him, for he judged fairly and walked among them often. But the prince had a hunger that peace could not fill, the hunger to understand all things. He read every book in his father's library, questioned scholars and mystics alike, and when no mortal could satisfy his curiosity, he sought answers from the unseen. One stormy night, while walking alone upon the shore, he saw something half buried in the sand, a lamp of blackened brass, engraved with words older than the sea. He lifted it, brushed away the salt, and whispered the ancient phrase that curiosity pressed to his lips. The lamp grew hot in his hand. Smoke burst forth, and a figure formed, a creature vast and terrible, its eyes burning blue as distant stars. "I am Aklathar, an Ifrit of the first fire," the being thundered. "For 1,000 years I was sealed by Solomon's command. Tell me your wish, and I will obey. But know this, every wish has its shadow." The prince trembled, but mastered his voice. "Then grant me knowledge of all hidden things." Aklathar bowed, and the world changed. In that instant, the prince saw the structure of the heavens, the pulse of the sea beneath the earth, the secret fears of every soul in his city. He saw his own heart, small, bright, and restless as a flame. At first, he rejoiced. With this knowledge, he ended famines, cured diseases, prevented wars before they began. His name spread as that of a saint, but soon the blessing turned to burden. He could no longer look at a man without hearing his secret envy, nor listen to a friend without sensing his hidden doubts. Sleep abandoned him, food lost its taste. He found that the more he knew, the less he could love. In despair, he called upon Aklathar once more. "Take back this gift," he cried. "Restore my ignorance, for I have lost my peace." The Ifrit laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "You cannot return what you have seen, but perhaps you can learn to close your eyes." The prince asked then, "What must I do to be free of you?" "Break the lamp," said the Ifrit, "but know that when you do, all the wisdom you have gained will vanish. You will return to being a mortal man, uncertain, limited, and afraid." The prince hesitated. To lose knowledge was to return to blindness, but to keep it was to live without joy. At last, he took the lamp and shattered it upon the rocks. The sea rose up in a cry of wind and thunder, and the Ifrit vanished like smoke at dawn. When silence returned, the prince felt something strange, something long forgotten. He felt ignorance, yes, but also wonder. He looked at the stars and realized that not knowing their secrets made them more beautiful. From that day forward, he ruled again, but gently now, uncertain, humble. He no longer sought to know every truth, only to listen. And in that listening, he found the wisdom he had once demanded by force. When Shahrazad finished, the king sat in stillness, his hands folded. At length he said, "To know everything is to lose the heart. Perhaps that is what I have been, an Ifrit in flesh." "You have been human, my lord," she replied softly, "and humanity is not a curse, but a responsibility." He looked toward the window, where a candle's flame quivered in the night breeze. "And what of power?" he asked. "Should it be cast aside like the lamp?" Shahrazad's eyes glowed faintly in the lamplight. "Not cast aside, majesty, only held lightly. Power is not a throne to sit upon, but a weight to balance. The prince who broke his lamp lost knowledge, but gained wisdom. The king who breaks his wrath may lose fear, but gain peace." The words lingered in the air like incense. That night, long after she had gone, Shahryar walked alone through his quiet palace. He passed the old execution square, now empty, and stood before the fountain that had replaced the block. The water's movement mirrored his thoughts, restless, uncertain, alive. He reached out and touched it. It was cold, clean, forgiving, and as the surface rippled, the king whispered, "May I learn to close my eyes." The moon looked down, silver and silent, upon a man who was no longer a monster, but not yet whole. And somewhere beyond the chamber walls, the city slept peacefully, dreaming of mornings that would not bring death. The next evening came soft and cool, a velvet dusk that draped the city like a promise. Shahryar waited by the window long before Shahrazad entered. He no longer ordered her to speak, he asked. When she appeared, carrying her quiet lantern, he said, "You have shown me mercy and wisdom and the limits of power. But tell me now, how does a man trust again, once betrayal has turned his heart to ash?" Shahrazad bowed her head. "To answer that, my lord," she said gently, "I must tell you of two brothers, one who lost his faith in love, and one who taught him how to find it again. There were once," she began, "two brothers, Bada and Anub, sons of a humble farmer. The elder, Anub, was married. The younger, Bada, worked beside him in the fields, honest and strong of spirit. One day, when the elder was away, Anub's wife cast her eyes upon the younger. She whispered words of temptation, offered him comfort and gold. Bada, horrified, refused her, saying, 'I honor my brother as I honor my own soul.' But fear twisted the woman's rejection into hatred. When Anub returned, she threw herself before him, tearing her dress, crying that Bada had tried to dishonor her. Rage blinded Anub. He seized his spear and chased his younger brother through the fields. The king's eyes narrowed. 'So the innocent must flee again,' he murmured. Shahrazad nodded. 'Yes, my lord, but the truth is patient. It waits until we are ready to face it.' As Bada ran, he prayed to the gods of the field. The earth itself opened to protect him, forming a river between the brothers. Anub stopped, trembling, and from the other side, Bada cried, 'Brother, do not believe lies spoken in anger. May the truth reach you as water reaches the sea.' And he took a knife and cut off his own heart, placing it in the branches of a sacred cedar, saying, 'When this tree is felled, my soul will perish. Until then, I will wander the earth in search of peace.' He disappeared into the wilderness. Years passed. One day, a storm broke, lightning struck the cedar, and the river ran red with sap. Anub, remembering his brother's words, wept and followed the current until he found, buried in the mud, the seed of that tree, and within it, the faint pulse of a living heart. He carried it home, placed it in a bowl of milk, and prayed. When morning came, Bada stood before him once more, alive, whole, and forgiving. The king sat very still. Shahrazad's voice was quiet, but her words entered him like a slow, steady heartbeat. "Did the elder beg forgiveness?" he asked. "He did," said Shahrazad, "but the younger did not demand it. He only said, 'We are brothers. The same sun that scorched you burned me also.' The two lived together once more, but both were changed. Anub learned that trust can be broken by lies, but restored only by truth that endures pain. Bada learned that love, once betrayed, does not die, it transforms. For a time, the only sound was the fountain whispering beyond the chamber. Then the king said softly, 'The story is beautiful, but false. In life, brothers do not forgive so easily.' Shahrazad's eyes shone. 'No, my lord. In life, forgiveness is never easy. That is why it is holy. When one heart chooses to stop the cycle of vengeance, it does not erase the wound. It transforms it into strength.' She paused, then added, 'Perhaps the gods planted your kingdoms wound for the same reason, to teach that even from betrayal, something purer may grow.' The king looked away, his throat tightening. 'Once,' he said slowly, 'I believed that trust could never be reborn. But now, when I hear you, it feels as though something long buried begins to stir.' That night, long after Shahrazad's voice faded, Shahryar walked the dark corridors of his palace. He passed the armory, the library, the courtyard where the headsman's block had once stood. In its place now stood a basin of water, lilies floating upon it. He knelt beside it and saw his reflection shimmer, a face no longer carved from stone. He whispered, 'If I could believe again, perhaps my kingdom could too.' He looked up and saw the faintest gleam of dawn breaking over the horizon. It painted the towers in light like forgiveness descending upon a weary soul. And for the first time in years, the king prayed, not for victory or vengeance, but for peace. The moon hung over the city like a patient witness. Below it, the streets of Baghdad glowed with the faint pulse of life returning. Lamplight in windows that had long been dark. Laughter from courtyards that had once held silence. In the palace, Shahryar sat beside Shahrazad with his hands folded, no longer upon the dagger at his side, but upon his heart. He said quietly, "You have spoken of men and brothers, of forgiveness and power. But what of a kingdom, Shahrazad? Can a whole city wake again after its soul has been buried in fear?" Shahrazad inclined her head, her voice soft as silk. "My lord," she said, "then hear the story of the sleeping city, which slumbered beneath a sorrow so deep that even time forgot it. There was once," she began, "a vast and beautiful city built beside a river of light. Its towers were tall, its people wise, and its rulers just. But as generations passed, pride grew like ivy on its walls. The people began to believe that wisdom was their birthright, and compassion a burden only for fools. So the river, offended by their arrogance, withdrew into the earth. Its waters vanished, its song was stilled, and slowly, the city began to sleep. Not a natural sleep, but an enchantment, a stillness that stole speech from lips and breath from hearts. Men and women froze mid-motion, their eyes half open, caught between life and dream. For 100 years the city slept. Dust thickened upon its domes, vines crept across its streets. Only the wind remembered its name. One day," she continued, "a wanderer came, a woman in a tattered cloak who had heard of the city that no longer breathed. She entered its silent gates and saw beauty trapped in glass, children motionless with laughter on their faces, merchants forever reaching to count their coins, a king seated on a throne of silver, his crown tilted as if he had fallen asleep mid-sigh. She wept, for she saw not death, but suspension, a punishment too gentle to be mercy, too eternal to be peace. So she prayed to the unseen powers, asking, 'What must I give to awaken them?' A voice answered, 'They will wake when someone loves them without hope of reward. When compassion touches stone, breath will return.' And so, the woman walked the streets, touching one frozen face after another. She whispered stories into their ears, stories of joy, of loss, of forgiveness. For years she did this, though none stirred. At last, one evening, she grew weak. Her cloak frayed, her voice cracked, and she fell asleep beside the river's dry bed. As she slept, her tears fell upon the earth, and where they landed, the ground shivered. A single drop struck the riverbed, and from it, a trickle of light began to flow. The next morning, Shahrazad said, the city awoke. Children blinked, merchants gasped, and the king opened his eyes. He found himself old, his kingdom overgrown, but alive again. The woman was gone, vanished into legend, but her footprints glowed faintly along the riverbank, as if the earth remembered the mercy that had touched it. Shahryar listened, his gaze distant, his hands trembling slightly. "What became of the woman?" he asked. "No one knows," said Shahrazad. "Some say she was a saint. Others believe she was the soul of the river itself, returned to test the hearts of men. But the wise say she was neither, only a human being who chose compassion where despair had lived." The king exhaled slowly. "And the city, did it remain awake?" "For a time," she answered. "But cities, like hearts, must be tended. When its rulers forgot the lesson of her love, sleep returned. Yet this time, the people remembered how to wake. They told her story to their children, so mercy would never again be mistaken for weakness." Silence lingered between them, deep and full. At last, Shahryar said, "I was that city. My soul slept beneath the dust of vengeance, and you have been that wanderer, walking my streets with your stories." Shahrazad bowed her head. "Then perhaps, my lord, the river has begun to flow again." He looked out the window. The Tigris shimmered faintly under the stars, its water alive with reflected moonlight. He felt something like a current moving inside him, a tenderness he had once thought dead. He said softly, "Tell me, Shahrazad, if the city must remember, how does it keep from sleeping again?" She smiled. "By continuing to tell its stories, my lord. For stories are the heartbeat of a people. When they are silenced, the heart falters. When they are spoken, the kingdom breathes." That night, as she withdrew, Shahryar remained at the window until dawn. When the first light touched the domes of Baghdad, he called for his vizier and ordered that the storytellers of the city, poets, singers, and chroniclers long silenced by fear, be summoned back to court. "Let their voices fill the halls again," he said. "Let every word be a drop of water upon the stone." And so, for the first time in years, the palace echoed not with cries of mourning, but with the sound of stories returning to life. That night the sky was clear as polished glass, and the stars hung low, bright as silver coins scattered across the dark. From the high balcony of the palace, Shahryar gazed upon his sleeping city. The lanterns in the streets, the distant hum of life returned. Yet in his heart there remained one unanswered question. Could a man truly be forgiven by the world he had wounded? When Shahrazad entered, he did not command her to speak. He said softly, almost in fear, "Tell me, wise one, how does a man look upon himself, truly look and not despair?" Shahrazad bowed her head and replied, "By looking not with the eyes, my lord, but with the heart." Then she began her tale. "There once was a king," she said, "mighty in war and rich beyond counting, who ruled a land of silver valleys and marble towers. Yet despite all his glory, he trusted no one, not his counselors, not his servants, not even the queen who loved him. One day, a foreign craftsman came to his court, carrying a mirror unlike any seen before. It was framed in gold and carved with verses in a forgotten tongue. The craftsman bowed and said, 'This is no ordinary mirror, Majesty. It shows not the face, but the truth that dwells beneath it. Whoever gazes within shall see their soul unveiled.' The courtiers whispered in awe, but the king laughed. 'My soul needs no mirror,' he said. 'I know who I am.' Still, curiosity stirred in him, and he ordered that the mirror be hung in his private chamber. The next morning, when he stood before it, he expected to see his proud reflection. Instead, he saw a stranger, a man with eyes clouded by fear, lips curled in cruelty, and hands red with invisible stains. He struck the glass in fury, but it did not break. Every day thereafter, he returned to it. Sometimes the reflection changed. Sometimes it showed a child lost in darkness. Sometimes a beast crouched in rage. Sometimes a weary old man weeping. Unable to bear it, he summoned the craftsman. 'You have cursed me,' the king cried. 'Take this mirror from my sight.' The craftsman bowed and said, 'Majesty, the mirror shows only what already exists. Break it if you must, but know that you will not destroy the truth, only blind yourself to it.' In his rage, the king smashed the mirror, but as it shattered, 1,000 shards flew across the room, and in each fragment he saw the same face, his own, multiplied, watching him from every corner. The vision drove him from his chamber, and he wandered the streets of his city in disguise, seeking someone who could help him forget what he had seen. One night, Shahrazad continued, he met a beggar woman warming her hands beside a dying fire. She offered him a seat beside her and said, 'You look as though you've seen yourself for the first time.' He told her of the mirror, of the cruel face that had looked back. The woman smiled. 'Then the curse has done its work,' she said. 'Now you may begin to change it.' He frowned. 'But how does a man change the face of his own soul?' 'Not by fleeing from it,' she said, 'but by softening what it reflects. Look upon your people, not as mirrors of your power, but as reflections of your mercy. Heal one wound, forgive one enemy, lift one burden, and each act will polish a shard of the mirror, until what you see there no longer frightens you.' Asterisk. And so he did. Day by day, she said, the king began to walk among his people. He listened to their stories, fed the hungry, freed the unjustly imprisoned, and rebuilt the homes his wars had ruined. He learned their names, their griefs, their small joys. And as the years passed, something in him began to shift. One morning, he found a piece of the broken mirror lying in the dust of his chamber. He lifted it, and this time, when he looked, he saw not the beast nor the frightened child, but a man who could meet his own eyes without flinching. The mirror had not changed. He had. Shahrazad's voice fell to a whisper. 'Thus, my lord, You became not a greater king, but a wiser one. For a man who knows his darkness and yet chooses light, he is the truest ruler of all. Shahryar sat motionless for a long time. The story was no longer a tale. It was confession and forgiveness woven together. He rose, walked to the window, and saw his reflection in the darkened glass. It no longer frightened him. "You have shown me my mirror, Shahrazad," he said quietly, "and in it I see both the man I was and the man I may yet become." She smiled. "Then the story has done its work, my lord." He turned back toward her, and for the first time since the long night began, he said the words she had waited nearly 1,000 evenings to hear. "Stay with me, not as prisoner, but as queen." That night, as dawn brushed the horizon, the palace bells rang softly. No orders for execution followed, only the sound of gates opening, welcoming the living day. The city breathed, and in its heart, a mirror once shattered began to mend. The days that followed were unlike any the palace had known. Where once guards had stood with swords drawn, now they stood with open hands, guiding the poor into the courtyards where food and music returned. Shahryar walked among them quietly, no longer as the Lion of Wrath, but as a man relearning the meaning of breath. And yet, in the quiet of his new peace, he began to wonder, could the change in one man redeem the wounds of an entire world? He had freed himself, perhaps, but his people had suffered for his blindness. How could one life, however reformed, restore what had been lost? That night, Shahrazad read the question in his eyes before he spoke it. "My lord," she said softly, "a single heart can become a wind that touches all corners of the earth. Allow me to tell you the tale of those winds. There was once a land," she began, "where the sky was divided into 4 kingdoms, each ruled by a wind of its own color and spirit. The north wind was white and cold, proud as judgment. The east wind was gold, swift as ambition. The south wind was crimson, warm with passion and life. And the west wind was blue, calm and sorrowful, keeper of memory and rain. For 1,000 years, these 4 ruled the heavens in harmony. Each carried its gifts across the earth, winter to cleanse, dawn to awaken, summer to feed, evening to soothe. But one age, pride took root. The golden east wind began to boast that its light was the source of all life, and it mocked the others. Without my dawn, it cried, your rain would fall on barren earth. Your warmth would scorch empty deserts. Your frost would serve no harvest. Angered, the other winds turned upon it. The white wind brought blizzards, the red wind storms of fire, the blue wind floods of grief. Their conflict tore the sky itself, and the world below shuddered. Seasons collided, snow upon flowers, drought upon rivers, flame upon frost, and the people who lived beneath their chaos began to despair. Then one day, Shahrazad said, a child was born in the valley between all 4 winds. He was neither god nor king, but he could hear the voices of the air. He grew up listening to their quarrels, their thunderous pride and sorrow. When he was grown, he climbed the highest mountain and cried out, Great winds, do you not see? In fighting for the sky, you have forgotten the earth that depends upon you. But they did not hear, so he took a different path. He built a flute of bone and reed and began to play. The melody was soft, too soft for storms to notice at first, but it carried truth. It sang of the frost that preserves, the fire that warms, the light that guides, the rain that forgives. The wind slowed, listening, and as the music rose, they realized that their power meant nothing without harmony. One by one, they bowed to the melody, mingling their colors, white, gold, crimson, blue, into a single wind of silver light. It swept across the earth, bringing balance once more. The snow melted where it should, rivers found their courses, and the people beneath looked up to see a sky whole again. When the song ended, the child was gone, his flute lying where he had stood, but the silver wind remained, whispering his tune through every season. When Shahrazad's voice faded, the king sat motionless, eyes lifted to the night sky above his city. The stars were faint tonight, veiled by a passing breeze. He felt it brush his face, cool, clean, alive. as though some spirit were moving through him. He spoke at last, barely more than a whisper. So even the winds must learn to forgive one another. Yes, my lord, Shahrazad said, for even the heavens fall into ruin when they forget that each strength becomes cruelty when severed from the rest. And the child, the king asked, was he a prophet? Perhaps, she said, or perhaps he was only a voice, like a story, reminding the powerful that their purpose is not to rule the world, but to sustain it. The king turned toward her. You have played that same melody for me, Shahrazad. You took my fury and my grief, my coldness and my desire, and wove them into something whole again. She smiled. I did not change you, Majesty. I merely gave your heart a song to remember. He looked once more out upon Baghdad. The night wind brushed the domes of the city, carrying laughter from far streets. The faint scent of bread from the bakeries reopened after years of fear, and in that wind he thought he heard it, the faint music of unity, echoing from the mountains of the unseen. He said, if one wind can forgive another, perhaps a king can forgive himself. Shahrazad bowed her head. Then your kingdom will never sleep again. That night, the wind moved softly over the river, carrying petals from the palace gardens into the streets below. Children chasing them laughed, their voices rising to the heavens, laughter that mingled with the wind like prayer. And far above, unseen by mortal eyes, the four-colored winds circled in harmony once more, their light merging into silver, the color of peace. The palace had changed. Gone were the silks of mourning and the hush of dread. In their place came music drifting from courtyards, the scent of jasmine rising in the evening air. But within the queen's chambers, Shahrazad moved quietly, her stories told, her purpose nearly fulfilled. Still, she sensed that one final thread remained unwoven. That night, when the king entered, he found her seated beside an oil lamp, not with parchment or jewels, but with a single sprig of mint in a bowl of water. He asked softly, "Is that your garden now, Shahrazad?" She smiled faintly. "It is the beginning of one, my lord, but it is not mine. It belongs to every soul that dares to keep something alive, even in the shadow of fear." He frowned gently. "Then tonight, tell me its story." She bowed her head. "As you wish. Tonight's tale is called The Hidden Garden. There was once," she began, "a queen who ruled beside a mighty monarch. Her beauty was praised throughout the land, but she carried a sorrow no one saw, the sorrow of seeing too much suffering, too much pride, too much silence. Her husband was powerful, feared by all, but his wrath had turned his palace into a tomb of echoing steps and whispering courtiers. Each morning, she woke to the sound of the executioner sharpening his blade, and each evening she prayed for one day without blood. When her prayers went unanswered, she sought another way. She found an abandoned courtyard deep within the palace walls, a forgotten place where weeds and thorns choked the earth. There she began to plant. One seed, then another. She watered them in secret with her tears. At first, nothing grew. The soil was heavy with the ash of burnt torches and the salt of old cruelty. But the queen was patient. She sang to the earth, small songs of mercy and memory, songs no one else heard. And one dawn, a single green leaf pushed through the dust. She tended it as one tends a newborn. Soon there were herbs for healing, flowers for fragrance, fruit trees for sweetness. The garden grew not by sunlight, but by her persistence. At night, the queen would carry a lamp through the winding corridors and enter her secret sanctuary. She spoke to the plants as one might speak to lost children. "You must live," she whispered, "for there is still goodness in the world, even if only here, behind stone walls." In time, the servants who stumbled upon the courtyard began to weep. Some knelt, touching the leaves as if in prayer. They said that the air there felt different, softer, safer, as though cruelty could not cross its threshold. The king heard rumors of this place, but dismissed them. What power could a patch of green have over the will of a monarch, he said. But one night, restless and unable to sleep, he followed the sound of distant singing and found his wife there, hands covered in soil, her face lit by lamplight. He stood watching her, unseen, and for the first time, he noticed that she was not the frightened woman he had imagined, nor the ornament of his court. She was alive with purpose, fierce in her gentleness, luminous in her quiet defiance. When she turned and saw him, she did not bow. Instead, she held out a seat. "This," she said, "is what I offer in place of fear. You have ruled with iron and flame, and it has brought silence, but not peace. Try ruling with life instead. See what grows." The king stared at the seed. He did not understand, but something in him stirred, a faint warmth where coldness had long reigned. He took it, planted it beside her, and for the first time in years, they worked together, not as ruler and subject, but as two hands tending one small hope. When the tree sprouted, Shahrazad said, "It bore fruit unlike any other, golden on the outside, crimson within." The king tasted it and wept, for it was both bitter and sweet, reminding him of everything he had lost and everything he might yet become. From that day, he ordered the garden's walls torn down. He commanded that the people enter freely, that children play there, and that every prisoner walk its paths before judgment was passed. "Let them breathe among the living," he said, "for even the guilty deserve a glimpse of what mercy feels like." And when he died centuries later, travelers said that the garden still bloomed, tended by unseen hands, watered by invisible tears. They called it the Garden of Compassion, and those who entered it left lighter, as though forgiven by the air itself. Shahrazad's voice fell into silence. The king sat beside her, his eyes shining with the reflection of the small bowl of mint leaves. "At last," he whispered, "I understand. All these nights, all these tales, you have been planting a garden in my heart." She smiled softly. "Then guard it well, my lord, for the soil of the heart is quick to dry." He reached across the small table, his hand covering hers. "The garden is no longer hidden," he said. "Let it grow until it covers the whole kingdom." That night, the courtyards of the palace filled with the scent of mint and orange blossom. Servants planted seeds in every window box, every crack between the stones. By morning, the palace no longer looked like a fortress, it looked like a home. And from its highest tower, a storyteller watched the dawn breaking through green leaves, her heart at peace, knowing the final seeds had been sown. The palace, once closed to all but nobles, now pulsed like a living heart. Merchants entered its gates bearing fruit and spices. Poets recited verses beneath its arches. Children ran laughing through halls, where once the sound of chains had echoed. And yet, for all the joy that had returned, a quiet question lingered in the king's mind. How far could mercy truly reach? One night, when the moon hung low and the jasmine air shimmered with music, Shahryar turned to Shahrazad and said, "You have healed my heart, my queen. But how do I heal a world beyond these walls? The people of my realm live in fear of kings, in hunger and in silence. How do I open a door wide enough for all of them?" Shahrazad looked upon him with eyes that had seen both cruelty and grace. "My lord," she said softly, "let me tell you the tale of the thousand doors, a story about the kingdom that forgot how to dream. There was once a city," she began, "so vast and beautiful that its towers touched the clouds. Its ruler, the architect king, had built it as a monument to human brilliance. Every building was perfect, every street straight, every gate carved with gold. But there was one flaw. Every door in the city opened only inward. It was said that the king, fearing enemies and thieves, had ordered his craftsmen to design locks that could not be opened from the outside. 'Let no stranger disturb our peace,' he proclaimed. And so, year by year, the city grew quiet, then still, then empty. People stopped visiting their neighbors. Merchants closed their shops. Poets ceased to sing, for there was no audience left to hear them. At last, the only sound that remained was the wind passing through corridors of locked doors. Then one day, a child was born who could not stand the silence. She grew up asking questions no one dared to answer. Why do our doors not open both ways? Why must we live behind walls built to protect us from the world, when the world is what gives us breath? Her parents scolded her, her teachers silenced her, but one evening, as the sun bled across the rooftops, she found a hammer in her father's workshop and struck the lock of her own home. It shattered with a sound like thunder, and for the first time in generations, the city heard the noise of a door opening outward. At first, people were terrified. The neighbors ran to scold her, saying, "You have invited danger into our peace." But when they saw the golden light spilling into her home, the scent of the outside world, spices, rain, the laughter of travelers, they began to weep. One by one, the people of the city followed her example. Doors flew open across the streets, and with every door, the city changed. Merchants returned, poets sang, children danced in the squares. The architect king, seeing the transformation, came down from his palace to see what his subjects had done. He was furious at first. The perfection he had built was gone. But as he walked through the bustling streets, he noticed something strange. The people were smiling. They greeted one another as family. And for the first time in his long life, the king felt something he had never designed: joy. When he returned to his palace, he ordered the royal gates torn down. "Let there be no walls too sacred for laughter," he said. "Let this city breathe again." From that day, the city became known as the City of 1,000 Doors, each one a reminder that safety without openness is only another form of prison. When Shahrazad's voice fell silent, the king sat still, his eyes unfocused, as if seeing beyond the palace walls. At last he said, "I was that architect once. I built walls to keep pain out, and in doing so, I locked life itself away." Shahrazad reached for his hand. "Then open your doors, my lord, all of them, not only those of the palace, but those of the heart and of your kingdom." He nodded slowly, his gaze bright with decision. "Then tomorrow we shall open them, every gate, every garden, every hall. Let the people come and walk where once only nobles stood. Let them see what mercy has built." And so it was. At sunrise, the heralds cried from every tower, "By order of the king, the palace of Baghdad is open." From the poorest quarters came families with baskets of bread and psalm. Scholars brought scrolls, artisans their tools, children their laughter. They entered not as subjects, but as citizens of a kingdom reborn. Shahryar stood beside Shahrazad at the marble gates, watching his people flood in. He said quietly, "It is not a palace anymore." "No," she replied, smiling. "It is a story, and every door you open becomes another chapter." That night, as the moon rose over the open courtyards and the 1,000 doors of the palace gleamed in its light, a wind passed through the city, carrying with it the hum of voices, the rhythm of footsteps, and the scent of life renewed. And somewhere in that living music, the storyteller heard a whisper, not from a god or a spirit, but from the soul of the kingdom itself. We remember the silence. We choose the song. The city had awakened, but the land beyond still carried its scars. Old villages lay in ruin where soldiers once marched. Fields long abandoned by farmers were now tangled with weeds. And along the great river that curved through the heart of the realm, the very artery that had once fed the capital, silence reigned. The king rode there one morning, accompanied only by Shahrazad and a handful of guards. The sun hung pale above the horizon, its light fractured across the water. Where there had once been fishermen in song, now only the wind whispered through broken reeds. Shahryar dismounted and knelt by the riverbank. "This land fed my forefathers," he said. "Now it runs shallow, as though it withholds forgiveness." Shahrazad stepped beside him, her veil lifted by the breeze. "Then you must hear its story, my lord," she said, "for every river remembers." He looked up at her. "Tell it to me." She closed her eyes and began. "There once was a river," she said, "so wide and so ancient that no map could measure its beginning. The people called it Al-Zahir, the Revealer, for its waters reflected truth. Those who came to its banks with clean hearts saw their faces clearly in its surface. But those burdened by cruelty or deceit saw only distortion, shapes that shifted like ghosts. For centuries, the river blessed the people. It gave them fish, fertile soil, and safe passage. But one generation, a new ruler rose who believed that rivers existed to obey kings. He commanded that dams be built, that the water be diverted to fill his private gardens. The river obeyed at first, for rivers are patient, but its heart grew restless. Where once it flowed in song, it now murmured darkly beneath stone. The fish died, the soil hardened, and the air filled with dust. The people cried to their king, but he silenced them. A ruler owes nothing to water, he said. It exists to serve. And so the river stopped serving. One night, Shahrazad continued, the current slowed to a whisper. The stars above reflected not upon water, but upon sand. The king awoke to find his fountains dry and his wells cracked. He sent priests to pray, but their voices echoed back unheard. He sent soldiers to dig, but the earth refused their shovels. At last, in despair, he walked barefoot to the riverbed and fell to his knees. "Why have you abandoned me?" he cried. And from the dust came a voice, soft, immense, unyielding. "You built walls against my flow," said the river. "You chained my freedom and forgot that I do not serve kings. I serve life." The king wept. "Then teach me to make amends." The river replied, "Return me to the people. Let my waters pass through every hand that thirsts, every field that hungers. And when you have done this, return yourself to them also. Only then shall I flow again." So the king gathered his builders and tore down his own dams. He broke the marble fountains that had once adorned his courtyards, using their stones to rebuild bridges and aqueducts. And when his hands were raw and his heart heavy with humility, he stood once more upon the empty riverbed and whispered, "Now flow as you will." That night, rain fell, not a storm, but a steady, endless rain. By dawn, the river had returned, and when the people came to its banks, they found their reflections clear once more. The river had forgiven. When the tale ended, the real river beside them shimmered faintly as though stirred by unseen hands. The king stared into it, his face wavering in the ripples. "I was that ruler once," he said quietly. "I built walls around my heart, thinking they would keep me strong, and all they did was dry the world around me." Shahrazad smiled gently. "Then let this river judge you anew, my lord. Touch it, and let it decide if your reflection is clear." He hesitated, then placed his palm upon the water. The current caught his skin cool, alive, forgiving. His reflection trembled, then steadied. The lines of sorrow softened. Behind him, the guards murmured. The air itself seemed to breathe again, and for the first time in decades, the birds returned to the riverbanks. That night, when they rode back to the city, the king issued a decree. The wealth once hoarded in the treasury would be used to restore the river's path, to rebuild bridges, mills, and irrigation canals for the farmers. He ordered that the oldest villages be resettled, and that any man or woman who had fled the war years be welcomed home without punishment. He turned to Shahrazad and said, "Your stories have restored my people's faith in me. Now let me restore their faith in the land." She bowed, her voice tender. "Then, my lord, your redemption is complete, for a kingdom's healing begins when its river sings again." And so it was. Within months, fields turned green, fishermen returned, and the songs of oars once more echoed along the water. Children threw stones into the river for luck, and old men whispered prayers of gratitude at sunset. The people began to call it the river that remembers, saying it carried not only water, but the memory of forgiveness. That when kings grew cruel or men forgot kindness, they needed only to look into its surface to be reminded of what mercy looked like. That night, as the moon rippled across the water and the city lights reflected like 1,000 stars below, Shahrazad whispered, "Now the land has forgiven, my lord. All that remains is for you to forgive yourself." And though he said nothing, the king looked upon the river and thought that perhaps, just perhaps, he already had. The thousandth night came softly, cloaked in the hush before dawn. A thin silver crescent hung above the palace, and the air was so still that even the torches seemed to hold their breath. For 3 years and 1,000 nights, Shahrazad had spoken, and for 3 years, a blade that once fell at sunrise had slept beneath its sheath. Now the time had come. In the quiet of her chamber, she dressed not as a queen, but as she had on the very first night, in a simple linen gown, her hair unadorned. She looked at the cradle beside her bed, where their 3 sons slept, and brushed a hand across their faces. Then, taking her lantern, she walked once more into the king's chamber. Shahryar was already there, awake, waiting. He stood at the window where the first hints of dawn blushed along the horizon. When he turned and saw her, his breath caught. For a heartbeat, he was not a king, but a man remembering the first time she had entered this room, trembling yet fearless, armed only with words. "Shahrazad," he said quietly, "you have given me more than life. But tell me, why do you look so solemn? Is there another story tonight?" She smiled faintly. "Yes, my lord, but it is not a story of others. It is our own. There once was a king," she began softly, "who built a wall around his heart, so high that even light could not enter. He thought it made him invincible, but in truth, it only made him alone. Then came a woman, not a warrior, not a saint, but a teller of tales. She brought with her no army, only the echo of ancient words. Each night, she built a bridge of story across his fear, until one dawn he found himself standing on the far side, where mercy lived and memory could heal. And though the woman spoke to save her life, in time she realized she was also saving his. The king, who had drowned the world in sorrow, learned to weep again, not from weakness, but from the rediscovery of his soul. The woman, who had come prepared to die, found that love, not death, was the final chapter. Their story, my lord, is the story I have told, not to others, but to you." The king said nothing. The lamplight flickered between them like the heartbeat of the past 1,000 nights. At last he spoke. "And now the tale is ended?" She nodded. "It is. The 1,000 nights have passed. I have no more stories left to keep the dawn at bay." His face darkened with sorrow. "Then what remains for us when the words are gone?" Her eyes glistened. "The choice, my lord. The same choice that faced you on the first morning, the blade or the dawn." For a long time, there was silence. Outside, the muezzin's first call to prayer rose faintly from the city, a sound older than any king. The sun had not yet broken the horizon. The king walked to the table where the executioner's decree had once been written. Its parchment long crumbled to dust. He reached for the sword that rested there, not in anger, but as if testing the weight of a past self. Then he turned to her. His eyes were wet, and his voice shook. "You came to this palace knowing you might die," he said. "Why?" She met his gaze without fear. "Because I believed, my lord, that even the darkest heart can be taught to listen, and that no soul, not even a king's, is beyond redemption." The sword slipped from his hand and struck the marble with a hollow sound. He fell to his knees before her. "Shahrazad," he whispered, "you have conquered me more completely than any army. You have slain the monster that lived within my chest. I cannot take your life, for it is my own that you have restored." She stepped forward, kneeling beside him, and for the first time in all their years together, she touched his face. "Then let the sun rise, my king. Let it rise without blood, without sorrow, for today we begin a new story." He bowed his head, and as the first light of dawn spilled into the chamber, the executioner waited outside the doors as he always had. But no summons came. Instead, the bells rang, not for death, but for rebirth. By decree of the king, all families who had lost daughters to the old madness were summoned to the palace. There, Shahryar stood beside Shahrazad before a gathered crowd. He spoke not as ruler but as man, voice trembling with both guilt and hope. "Once," he said, "I took your daughters in cruelty, but one woman taught me what it means to be human again. In her name, and in their memory, I vow that never again shall fear rule this house. Let it be known that this kingdom belongs not to vengeance, but to mercy. And when the crowd wept, it was not out of grief, but out of release. That night, Shahrazad walked through the palace gardens. The moonlight fell across the fountains that now replaced the executioner's block. She heard laughter echoing from distant halls, the rustle of silk and song where once had been silence. When the king found her, she turned and said softly, "It is done. The story that began with death has ended with life." He smiled. "No, my love, it has not ended. It has only changed its voice." As they stood together beneath the stars, the dawn began to break once more. And this time, it was not a sentence, but a promise. The 1,001st night had come, and with it, the story of the woman who saved a kingdom with her words found its rest. Not in silence, but in the breath of a new morning. Years passed, and the palace that had once known only grief became a sanctuary of learning and song. Children studied beneath fig trees in courtyards where the scent of jasmine and ink mixed with the hum of bees. Travelers from distant lands, Persia, Damascus, Samarkand, Cairo, came to hear the tales that had transformed a king's heart and, in turn, a kingdom. But time, as it always does, carried away the faces and names of those who once walked the marble halls. The king's beard turned white, his steps slowed. Shahrazad's hair, once black as midnight, gleamed now like moonlight. Their sons grew into men, one a scholar, one a poet, one a builder of bridges who said that stone and story were made from the same faith. And still, the stories lived. When Shahrazad could no longer rise to speak before the court, she asked to be carried to the garden, the same one where she had once planted mint in a bowl of water. There, she sat beneath the oldest tree and called for her children. "My sons," she said, "when your father and I are gone, people will remember the palace, the river, the kingdom, but they must also remember this truth, that words have the power to change the shape of the world. A sword can end a life. A story can save one. Guard the stories I have told you. Pass them on not as commandments, but as gifts. Let them live not on parchment, but in the hearts of those who listen." Her sons knelt before her, their eyes wet with devotion. The eldest said, "Mother, what if the world forgets?" She smiled faintly. "Then tell them again." That night, as lamps flickered across the river, the people of Baghdad gathered in the great courtyard. They had heard that the Queen of Stories was fading, and they wished to give thanks. Poets recited verses about the knights that had saved a kingdom. Fishermen told their children that even the river's voice had changed since she came. And an old woman, who had once been a servant in the palace, whispered to the crowd, "She taught us that no one is too small to matter, and no heart too broken to heal." High above, in her chamber, Shahrazad listened to their words drifting through the open window. She leaned toward the sound, as though catching the echo of her own voice returning to her from the hearts of others. And then, as the moon climbed over the domes of Baghdad, she closed her eyes and slept, her last breath a whisper of peace. The next morning, Shahryar walked alone through the palace gardens. The dawn was soft, its colors pale and forgiving. He stopped before the fountain that had replaced the executioner's block and bowed his head. "She saved me," he murmured, "and through me, she saved them all." He ordered that the story she had told be written and preserved, every word, every parable, every lesson. The scribes worked for years, binding them into a collection that would travel beyond the walls of Baghdad, across the deserts, over the seas. They called it Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1,001 Nights. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Cities turned to dust and were built anew. Yet the tales endured. In candlelit rooms of Damascus, storytellers recited her words to merchants weary from travel. In the bazaars of Cairo, children gathered around old men who spoke of Sinbad and Aladdin. Across oceans, scholars copied her tales into new tongues, each adding pieces of their own soul to the telling. And so the stories grew, not as monuments of stone, but as rivers of memory. They carried the voice of a woman who had once faced death with nothing but courage and imagination. Through her, the world learned that storytelling is not escape, it is survival. In time, the collection reached land Shahrazad had never known. In the cities of Europe, dreamers read her tales by candlelight and began to write their own. In the farthest reaches of the world, her name became a symbol, not merely of beauty or wit, but of the infinite resilience of the human spirit. Artists painted her beneath starlit canopies, her lips poised between life and death. Poets wrote that she spoke until the dawn learned mercy. And even in modern times, when machines replaced parchment and screens replaced lamps, her voice lingered, reborn with each retelling, her courage breathing anew in the mouths of others. It is said that if you listen closely at midnight, when the wind passes over an open book, you can hear the faint echo of a woman's voice whispering, "Once upon a time, there was a king," and somewhere a listener's heart softens. Somewhere a tyrant hesitates before choosing cruelty. Somewhere a child dreams of a better world. That is how stories live. For in the end, Shahrazad's true magic was never in her tales alone, but in what they awakened in others, the courage to change, the patience to forgive, and the unshakable belief that light can emerge even from the darkest night. And so her 1,001 nights never truly ended. They simply changed form, becoming every story told in hope, every word spoken in mercy, every voice raised to remind the world that love, not fear, is what endures. And if one listens to the hush before dawn, that sacred stillness between darkness and light, one might imagine that Shahrazad herself still sits by the window of eternity, her voice gentle as the wind, her eyes bright with knowing, whispering again and again